Okay, welcome everyone to the live briefing on administrative measures, human rights and democracy in turbulent times. My name is Tanja Mera and I'm a senior researcher at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, where I lead the program Rule of Law Responses to Terrorism. So for those of you who may not be familiar with ICCT, ICCT is a think and a do tank, and we conduct evidence-based research, we provide policy advice, we develop good practices together with international and regional organizations, we deliver training and workshops, and we also have an M&E Center of Excellence. So also with respect to the topic of administrative measures, it is in fact one of the research priorities of the Rule of Law Responses program at ICCT. And over the years, we have conducted quite a few research and produced research papers and policy briefs. We have also worked closely with different governments on providing policy advice on the use of administrative measures in a counterterrorism context. We had the privilege to work as an implementing partner of the GCTF, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, Criminal Justice and Rule of Law Working Group, and developed the first human rights compliant guidelines on the use of administrative measures in a counterterrorism context. In addition, we have delivered and developed a policy toolkit on this and have also given several workshops on this topic. And we are very pleased that last year, our visiting fellow, Cyprian, has written a policy brief on this topic. And this is also the reason why we are here together to discuss his policy brief and in the broader context, how administrative measures are being applied in turbulent times. So before I introduce the speakers to you, I just want to briefly mention and explain what administrative measures are. Maybe some of you might be less familiar with the term. Now, that's not that strange because first of all, there isn't a universally agreed definition on administrative measures. What we consider administrative measures in the context of countering terrorism is it are restrictive or coercive measures. They are imposed on an individual or an entity. They are imposed by an executive or in some cases even a judicial body, but without a lot of judicial overview. But what is important is that they are being imposed without laying criminal charges. So this means that there are no criminal proceedings in the court, and they often tend to be or supposed to be temporary in nature. And they are imposed because there is a risk to national security. And when we say restrictive measures, then we mean it restricts the exercise of human rights. This could be the freedom of movement, it could be the freedom of speech, it could be a range of or cumulative effect on human rights. And to give you a few examples, administrative measures, those would include actually also designations, but also control orders, area ban, reporting duties at police stations, and deprivation of nationality. So now allow me to introduce to you briefly the three speakers. We have with us Colin Clark, and he's the Director of Research at the Soufan Group. And we have with us Raphael Kemp, and he's a criminal and human rights lawyer and also conducted research in the area of counterterrorism measures, in particularly in France. And we have with us Cyprien Fleuven, and he is a PhD researcher at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and he's a researcher at the Turbulent Institute and the author of the policy brief. So I'm very glad all of you are able to join us today to discuss this topic. And before we kick off with the panel, I would like to give briefly the floor to Cyprian, as we have a small video we would like to show of the Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights, and also former associate at ICCT, Professor Ben Saul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya, indeed. And Ben Saul could not join us, but he has shared with us this statement, which I will now play.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to briefly contribute to this event, in part discussing a policy brief authored by my friend Cyprian Flusen. The brief makes a valuable contribution to deepening our knowledge through country case studies of the burgeoning use of administrative measures to counter terrorism and their impacts on human rights, civil society, and democracy. I also acknowledge the sustained intellectual leadership on administrative measures by the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism, which published other policy briefs on foreign fighters in 2016 and on the rule of law and gender and age implications in 2021. While there's a long history of using coercive administrative restrictions against individuals to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism, their use continues to expand, with frequent reproduction across jurisdictions and the creation of new types. They can certainly play a legitimate security role, but as today's event suggests, their proliferating use continues to raise many concerns about their consistency with international law and other rule of law values. Administrative measures may affect many human rights, including in relation to liberty, movement, travel, privacy, expression, association, assembly, religion, family, and nationality. The cross-cutting human rights concerns encompass the adequacy of their legal bases, their necessity and proportionality, non-discrimination and equality, due process and judicial safeguards, effective remedies, derogation in emergencies, protections under international humanitarian law, and evaluation and monitoring. There are also concerns about their proper interaction with traditional criminal justice processes and their own tendency to have a de facto punitive effect without the safeguards of criminal process. There is a temptation to design or use them precisely to circumvent criminal law safeguards, creating a parallel legal system that normalises exceptionalism. Unjustified or excessive administrative measures not only affect the rights of persons genuinely suspected of terrorism, but can also violate the rights of innocent individuals and be used to repress legitimate civil society actors, including transnationally or through international cooperation. Efforts to develop guidance are welcome, such as the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum's 2019 Glion recommendations on the use of rule of law-based administrative measures in counter-terrorism. More intensive and systematic rights-based scrutiny and guidance is nonetheless still needed to interrogate the diversity of measures and the distinctive human rights issues raised by the different kinds, and also to help rein in excessive and destructive laws. To that end, my thematic report to the Human Rights Council next year will focus on administrative measures, including to identify good practices as well as areas where states can and should do better. I look forward to collaborating in due course with any of you interested in advancing these issues. Thank you.
That was excellent. Good to hear a quick overview of the many procedural issues also at play and the implications also of applying administrative measures before, during, or after criminal proceedings. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes. At the end, there is a Q&A session. Please feel free to submit any questions you have, and if possible, also indicate whom you would like that one to be answered. If not, we will ourselves cherry pick which ones you would like to address. The live briefing is being recorded and it's being made available to registered participants. And at the end, there is also a short survey we would kindly ask you to fill in. Now, without further ado, I would like to start, and I think let's first go to Colin. So, Colin, we've seen, I mean, in fact, administrative measures are not new, also not in a counter-terrorism context, but we have seen that the use of administrative measures has expanded quite a bit over the years. And it was actually mainly used in the context of jihadi terrorism. But the terrorism landscape has the terrorism landscape has changed significantly in not only, I mean, in Europe, but also in the US and other parts of the world. And I would like to ask you if you could walk us through how this terrorist threat has evolved in recent years and what this also means in terms of how to address this with the limited resources that states have to address this evolving threat.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya, and thank you to ICCT for the opportunity to speak on this panel today. I've been a fellow with ICCT since 2016 and have great respect for the work that my colleagues there do. It's one of the top institutions looking at this issue in the world. You're absolutely right, Tanya. A lot has changed over the past several years, and I would put a flag down in 2019. We just passed the 5-year mark of the collapse of the caliphate, the physical caliphate in Baghouz. That was the same year I published a book on the Islamic State called After the Caliphate. And I think, I've been forcing myself to really think hard about what's different, right? 5 years may not seem like a long time, but today with modern technology, a lot can change and a lot has changed. I wrote a piece last year sometime for the Foreign Policy Research Institute where I talked about, what are some of these emerging trends in terrorism. Spent a lot of time thinking about this and just as a heuristic, I called it the 5 Ds, and I'll walk through those briefly. I think the first is diversity, right? The threat is far more diverse than it's been in a long time. We spent 2 decades of the global war on terrorism. We called it the global war on terrorism, and we could leave aside that acronym because I think it's terrible. It's also makes no sense to declare war on a tactic. But, what we meant by that, at least in the US, was a war against Salafi jihadists, right? It was a specific kind of terrorism, and that was largely comprised by Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and their various affiliates, branches, and franchise groups around the world. Now, those groups are very much still active. They've ebbed and flowed, and I think, right now, a group like ISIS-K is at the very top of the security agenda for many counterterrorism forces. We're about a month out from the Paris Olympics, and there's a lot of concern about the threat that ISIS-K poses. But it's not the only group. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you have groups like JNIM and others that are on the march. You've got large swaths of contiguous territory controlled by jihadists, pushing out toward the West African littoral, all the way east toward the Lake Chad Basin, massive amounts of territory. So the first is that the threat is diverse because, and this came up in an interview I was doing with a former UK intelligence professional. He said something that's really stuck with me. And he said, nothing ever falls off the plate, meaning that threat still exists, but we've now got others added to it. And so, these other groups, we've got, after October 7th, we've now are reminded of Shia groups and this kind of so-called axis of resistance, Iranian-inspired proxies throughout the world. We've got the far right, which is on the march in various parts, especially in the West. And within the US, we kind of divide the far right threat up into several subcategories. We've got neo-Nazis and white supremacists, or what we call REM-V actors, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. We've also got anti-authority and anti-government violent extremists, agave, which doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but I think in Europe, sometimes these are referred to as anti-institutional actors, and there's a number of ways, if you look at what's happening in Germany with some of these groups that are kind of melded with conspiracy theories, kind of a little bit of a sprinkle of QAnon there. And then we've got a rising far left. Cyprian alluded to this earlier. Is there a lot of smoke or fire there? My own take, and look, we just have to look at the data. The far right is far more active and deadly, However, I do see a future where the left becomes more engaged, and I think a lot of that will flow from what we're seeing now in Gaza, especially in the West, where you see individuals practicing nonviolence, but also recognizing that those protests only go so far. And so I'm actually working on a piece now where I'm kind of digging back and looking at some comparisons from the late 60s and 70s, groups like the Weather Underground, groups like Baader Meinhof in Germany, to see if there's anything there. We've got a kind of grab bag of other types of groups too, incels, QAnon conspiracy theorists, and what we call the salad bar terrorists, where people kind of pick and choose elements of different ideologies across the ideological spectrum, kind of put them together, and especially the accelerationist types, right, that really just want to bring down the system at all costs, are a major threat here. So diverse, I think groups are, the second D is decentralized, right? The groups are spread throughout the world. They're less hierarchical, they're more networked, and that's facilitated by advanced communications technology, the internet, et cetera. Especially in a post-COVID world where people are back to traveling, you're going to see that move from online to offline, and see some real world synergies there. The third D, I'd say, is democratized. So the barrier to entry for a lot of these groups to now engage in getting their hands on things like drones, 3D printing, et cetera, right? Civilians can now do that. And I can tell you, I'm down in Tampa, Florida this week at Special Operations Forces Week, and there's a trade show, and the things that you can purchase down here are quite amazing. A backpack with a drone in it, right, for civilian use, and all sorts of other things. The fourth D, I'd say, is disinformation, and terrorists and insurgents are really good at harnessing this, of using this to their own advantage. And as artificial intelligence becomes more ubiquitous with deep fakes, we're going to see a lot more of this, and we're going to see a lot more of its effective use, quite frankly. And then the 50 is deadly. We've now seen an increase in lethality. And again, a lot of this aided or undergirded by advances in technology. In the United States, we have a pretty unique situation because of the availability of weaponry, right? And so our far right attacks, whether it's El Paso or Buffalo, New York, have tended to be more lethal because pretty much anyone can walk into a store and buy a machine gun, just kind of absurd. The last piece of this is that it's all transnational, right? So there's a saying, if you may have heard, all politics is local. And I've always been a fan of that saying because I think it's true. I would add to that, if all politics is local, all conflict is global. What happens in one part of the world no longer stays there. It impacts diaspora communities. It impacts countries across the world. So we see a diffusion of ideology, a co-optation of various narratives. The farmers' protests in Europe, good example. I've seen videos of farmers' protests in Europe where people are holding up Second Amendment signs from the US. Gun culture has nothing to do with it, right? And it's kind of now migrating online, and people are championing causes that on their face don't make sense. What does this all add up to in terms of more use or abuse of administrative measures? Cyprian, I liked the part of your title that included in turbulent times, because I think that's indeed correct. And when you're in turbulent times, people want security, they want safety. That increases the chances of some kind of strongman figure or potentially far-right government attempting to use administrative measures or abuse them. We've already seen former President Trump, who's running again, threaten the protesters on university campuses in the United States. How much is that as politics versus how much will he actually go through with it if he wins the election in November? I think a lot of people are concerned about that. So why don't I leave it there for now, and we can always revisit any of these threads that I discussed and kind of pull on those and get into more detail as needed.
Thanks, Colin. This was super useful, as a background on how the terrorist threat is changing, and it's not becoming less but more complex. And I think you raised a lot of issues which many of us recognize. And one of the things that come to mind is also here now we see that the there are more also protests at the universities, and you see a mix of people who are attending these protests, and it are not only students, but there are also other groups which are taking part, which may be a bit more violent than some of the students. And I think one of the questions it raises is it a threat to national security, or is it a threat to public order? And what kind of measures are you using? Are you using administrative measures designed in the context of countering terrorism to handle a public order issue? Or do you have enough other resources available under a local authority might have to deal with demonstrations? So I think there is where you see that it is becoming more trickier. And I think this is where I think Cyprian would be able to shed some light and maybe, walk us through how you see administrative measures are being applied more recently in Europe in the context of these, changing threats we see. And maybe it's also good if you would explain more clearly, what is the distinction between misuse, abuse, and overuse of administrative measures, and in particular, the distinction between a threat to national security or a threat to public order. I give the floor to you, Cyprian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you, Colin, as well, and thank you to Ben, who can't be with us. I think you all summarized extremely well already what my whole the whole issue I cover in the policy brief is, and I think, Colin, I almost don't need to add anything to what you said. Because that's exactly what you said in terms of what happens in turbulent times and what happens especially in relationship to the need for security and so on. But I'll get to this in a few seconds. But briefly, I think, as Tanya said, and as Ben also mentioned, administrative measures are not new, but they are, in fact, they reflect a trend and a practice that is extremely common in times of emergency, especially security emergencies, which is to transfer more of the power from the judicial or the legislative branch to the executive branch. And I think maybe Rafael, you'll also share some insights with us on this later, but this is an extremely common practice. Now, administrative measures, which we've started looking at as a specific category of counterterrorism tools, we've seen used in the past, we've seen used in Ireland, in the UK during the Troubles, we've seen used it over the years, but it started picking up more in the past 5 years, especially in response to ISIS and the growth of ISIS and the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters traveling there. And so a lot of these administrative measures became actually an integral, core part of a number of states' response to the phenomenon, either to prevent people from traveling, to prevent them from going to specific events, to allow the police to search their houses even without warrants from courts and so on, and in the most extreme cases to strip them of their nationality, including to prevent them from returning home. So that's when we saw a significant increase in the use of administrative measures. And so my whole question then was, given everything Colin has said on the evolution of the counterterrorism and the terrorism landscape, could these tools, administrative measures that provide a lot of flexibility, not a lot of oversight for the national security agencies, could they turn out to be more dangerous maybe than they already were in the past? And so my main argument there is that in my research, I didn't identify any danger that we didn't really know about yet. What I did identify are patterns that suggest and that show how we could see those measures now used more broadly. One of the starting point of this is, as Colin said, the threat is more diverse, more across the spectrum of ideologies, less organized and so on, which makes the job of national security and counterterrorism agencies more difficult. And we've heard intelligence agency heads and other policymakers say it and say, our job has become a lot harder because, as Colin has said, it's not like jihadi terrorism has vanished in the meantime. So now we have jihadi terrorism, far-right terrorism, maybe left-wing terrorism, maybe environmental activism and so on. And at the same time, we have more activism, we have more instances of political violence, even if they're not terrorist as such. we have more unrest, we have more protests, we have more, and so on. Alongside this, we also see the political discourse in many countries and the political environment becoming a lot more tense, meaning that we also now hear commonly mainstream politicians call dissidents terrorists, for instance. And that's something we've seen in France, where some environmental activists were called eco-terrorists and so on. And this is something we've seen also in Hungary. We see it obviously in other regimes, you know, like in Russia, in Turkey, and so on. But we've also seen that pick up in the US as well, where some of the protesters or Black Lives Matter protesters have been called terrorists. So in this context, my question was, again, do administrative measures pose specific risk? And my conclusion is probably. And here, one of the main issues, and maybe we'll discuss that later, is that I don't have a lot of quantitative data to prove that is the case. Why? Because administrative measures, as opposed to judicial measures, are not publicized. There is no publicly available data on how many are used against who, what are the types of measures, what are the consequences of those measures, and so on. So essentially, it's a bit of a black box, except for some parliamentary reports and so on. And so that makes it difficult for me to say, well, there is a massive increase, or we do see already patterns of abuse. What I have been able to identify, and what I've relied on in the brief for those who might have had a look, are case studies. And in the case study, I identified circumstances under which we see such misuse, abuse, or overuse. And we see that those circumstances don't sound that exceptional at all in today's environment, and we could see a lot more of this. Now, to get to the distinction between overuse, abuse, and misuse, I think it's an important distinction that came to me when looking at these different cases, because sometimes we hear, you know, like you have to trust more the national security authorities. They're not going to try and crack down on people's activism and so on. And my argument there was to say, well, actually, even if they don't intend to, the current frameworks and the current practices around administrative measures makes it already dangerous enough and allows for inadequate uses. So the abuse scenario is the most clear-cut. It's the one where we have an actor, an executive actor, using administrative measures for purpose that is not the intended purpose. And the example I cite in the report is when Donald Trump wanted to classify as terrorist organization Antifa. And we know that there was a political reason behind this. And we know that even though from a legal perspective, it would have been a little tricky to actually qualify this movement as terrorists, it was a political message at the time. But then there is also the misuse, where even if the intention might be right, might be to indeed ensure security, they might still push the use of administrative measures beyond their intended purpose. And that's the examples I refer to in the French case, for instance, where we saw local authorities use counter-terrorism administrative measures to ensure public order. And to prevent protests and so on that they thought were going to be disruptive. So in this particular case, there was no political gain, there was no ill intention. The goal was to ensure security, and the local authorities used everything that was available to them, including, in this case, counterterrorism measures. And then there is the case, a little trickier, of overuse, and that's the case of Canada that I use. And here I'll be interested to hear what the thoughts and maybe the comments are from the other panelists and the audience. Because here my argument is to say, well, even if we use these measures for the right reasons, so to fight terrorism, using them at maybe the pace that we seem to be using at the moment could down the line pose a problem anyway. Even if it might be lawful, every single instance of use might be lawful, at the end of the day, it might still pose a problem. And here the example I used is that of the Canadians listing a set of far-right groups as terrorists, which prevents any Canadian from engaging with them, supporting them, having a bank account, traveling, all sorts of things. And here my reasoning was that this measure was probably legal. Now, if we start seeing a lot more of those, and that maybe start encroaching on groups that are not really terrorists, that may be even violent groups or violent activist groups, but not terrorists, we also set the precedent for tomorrow illiberal politicians maybe using them against dissidents or against human defenders or against pretty much everybody they feel like. So the overuse creates a precedent and creates a framework in which we may see more of those abuses. And then the last point that Tanya referred to is also that of the boundaries of counterterrorism. What are we talking about? And here what we've seen is, especially the French case, for instance, is we see authorities using for regular public order missions counterterrorism mechanisms. And again, here they may be well-intentioned, but still that means that a mechanism that was created to deal with a specific threat at a specific time in a specific context is used increasingly in ordinary circumstances. And we already see it with some special also police units and so on used in regular riot control or crowd control. But in administrative measures, I think it raises particular concerns because those measures are easy to adopt. A lot of authorities have the power to adopt them. They're in theory a little maybe less high stakes than prosecution and sending somebody to jail, but still they cause significant consequences. And so I think all these circumstances together create a situation where misuse, abuse, or overuse may create new adverse consequences that we hadn't quite anticipated, affecting not only the people and the group concerned, but also the civic space and the democratic space as a whole, especially again, if we think of the trends that we already see in the degradation of trust with respect to democracy institutions and so on. So this is my take on risks that we've known for a while, but that might have been heightened by the current circumstances, and that, in my opinion, call for a heightened caution in our use of these measures. But I think I'll stop here because I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Thanks, Cyprian. Indeed, let us go to our two other panelists and give them also a chance to respond. As you indeed indicate, at the one hand, the challenge you face in actually having quantitative data to say that there is an increasing use, but at the same time saying that there might be a heightened risk. So maybe first to Raphael, I mean, feel free to respond to Cyprian, but it would be also good if you could integrate in your comments how you see the use of administrative measures being applied in France, whether only in the context of jihadi terrorism or also beyond in some of the other areas that have been mentioned, and what specific challenges you see in practice. It would be good to hear from you first. First, yours, Raphael.
I think, Raphael, you might be muted. Raphael, can you hear me?
You're still muted.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. So, as I wrote in a book about anarchists in France in the late 19th century, and I discovered through historical research that laws could be made against an enemy, like at that time anarchists. But very quickly, these kind of laws are applied to almost anybody and to any kind of dissent. And my point is today that administrative measures are maybe not useful to fight terrorism, but they are used, especially in France, as a way to criminalize dissent. So the question you asked me, Tanya, which is written in the document, is why do states resort to administrative measures? From a legal viewpoint, as a lawyer, I would say that for states, it's easier because a judicial overview comes after the measure and not before, as it is usually under criminal law. And the state does something, it takes a measure which has an impact on somebody, and this measure is legally deemed prima facie in compliance with the law. It is up to the one who is targeted by the measure to go before, in France, before an administrative court and ask the judge for the measure to be cancelled. And generally speaking, judges do things that the state was right to take the measure. I will give you an example. In late December 2015, just a month and a half after the November 13 terrorist attack in Paris, I went to an administrative court where I was challenging an order of the police authorizing a house search as an administrative measure. I said the intelligence information were not correct, and especially not supported by facts and documents. And during the hearing, the judge told me a very French expression. I will try it in English, I don't know. He told me there is no smoke without fire, meaning that if the state decided to search the home of my client, it should have had a good reason for that. And it's up to me to prove that the state was wrong, which is very difficult. I could also say that measures which are not designed as counter-terrorism can be taken using such a reason. For example, in Paris, 2 weeks ago, we had a demonstration against police brutality, which is a big issue in France. And the head of the police of Paris decided to forbid this demonstration before it happens for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons why he decided to take this measure was because he said he didn't have enough law enforcement officers to secure the demonstrations because they were used at counter-terrorism operations and to fight, to protect the nation because of the terrorism threat. It's a way of showing how the terrorism threat can be used in normal public order issues like a demonstration. Hopefully, in that case, the administrative court decided the police was wrong and the demonstration could take place. So I will speak about some administrative measures we have in France, and especially about administrative measures taken just after the November 13, 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris. At that time, the state decided to use a very old law, which has been passed in France in 1955 to fight against Algerians who were fighting for their independence at that time. And this law is called the State of Emergency Law. And in 2015, it has been used, for example, to forbid demonstration for climate change, for the climate. Because at that time in Paris, we had a big summit about climate change, and a lot of people were gathering in the street and demonstrating. And because of the state of emergency law, more than 300 protesters have been brought to police custody at that time. It was in November 2015. We had under the same law of 1955, at that time in 2015 and 2016, house arrest of individuals who are environmental activists, and they were deemed as a threat to the nation and put under house arrest. We have many examples like that at that time. A little bit later, I will speak about a case, a travel ban case, because this is one of the administrative measures we spoke about. In 2016, I was the lawyer for a Frenchman who happens to be a leftist and who went to northern Syria to fight with the Kurdish groups against the Islamic State. So he took part of fights in Raqqa, for example. And what happened when he went back to France is that the police decided to take his passport and to forbid him to travel again to Syria to fight with the Kurdish people. And the state did that on the basis of a law made against people to join the Islamic State. So that was really, I mean, kind of strange to use a law made against ISIS, used against someone who is fighting ISIS. Hopefully, we went to the administrative court, and the administrative court in Paris decided that fighting with the Kurdish people is not a terrorist activity, which is, I think, obviously true, because the international coalition worked, I mean, and fought with the Kurdish people. The third, my third example is a law which has been passed in 2015 before the terrorist attack, but in the context of terrorism threat, which is what we call intelligence law of 2015. And it gives power to secret services in France to, for example, listen to phone calls of a target, to put microphones in his house, because the secret services think such people could be a threat to the nation and for counter-terrorism reasons. So the information which is gathered with this secret surveillance that can bring to a normal judicial case and to criminal investigations. And we are at the border between administrative measures and judicial measures. But what is really interesting in such case is that we don't really have a judicial remedy to criticize the way of the secret services use this kind of secret surveillance. So if I have some time, I have other examples if you want about administrative measures in France, but I don't know if you want me to go on these issues.
No, I think you gave us a clear idea of, how it is being used in practice by giving some practical examples. I think I want to give Colin just briefly the floor and allow him to respond to, the abuse, overuse, in particular the designation of right-wing extremist groups like in Canada, to reflect on that before we move on to the next section.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, I think, it's often boiled down to the slippery slope argument. And Cyprian mentioned earlier Donald Trump's threat years ago to designate Antifa, when at the time the data showed overwhelmingly that it was groups on the far right that were committing large-scale acts of violence, right? And I had a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago for War on the Rocks with a scholar named Michael Kenny. And it's actually the second most read piece on War on the Rocks of all time. What is Antifa, what it isn't, and why it matters. And we kind of walked through this. But I think that's entering a pretty dark place, in my opinion, if we get to an area where terrorism itself is politicized, right? And so without exploring the old definitions of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and I'll leave that to Alex Schmid, who's been educating us on the definitions of terrorism for decades. But putting that aside, if that becomes something where it can be wielded as a political cudgel, depending on which administration is in power, I think we're in a very, very bad place. Look, we're a couple of months out from the 2024 election, and I think just speaking to people all over the country, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of concern about what happens in the lead up to this event. Are we going to start seeing demonstrations, protests, and political violence? I'm more concerned about the aftermath. I mean, look, for some people, January 6th is a distant memory, but it's something I think about on an almost daily basis. And now we're entering an election where we have the same two candidates, and there are people asking Trump if he'll accept the results of the election, and he's not committing to that. So it's almost in a way reliving a strange dream. It's hard to believe that a lot of this is real, but here it is, kind of playing out in front of us. So the other thing I wanted to address just briefly is Cyprian's comment on the lack of data. I mean, a huge challenge in this area, right, to come up with empirical evidence to support your argument. What we do have is the kind of really the luxury of looking back at some of these historical cases you mentioned. And you mentioned Northern Ireland, and I think we don't need a ton of data to see how things played out there. Go back to the 1970s with internment without trial, really a disastrous and highly counterproductive policy implemented by the UK. That's the case I've probably studied the most in my life is Northern Ireland. And, I forget which book it came from, but there was a quote where it said, after internment, if you weren't in the IRA going in, you certainly were on the way out, right? And so the blowback is often underappreciated, what we would call second order effects of some of these policies. And moreover, you know, if you have somebody that's a borderline case, and Tanya knows this well with all of her work on CVE and some of the great work done by ICCT on prison radicalization, including work that Thomas Renard has done, you know, putting somebody in jail can actually harden them and make them more radicalized on the way out. So I think just being judicious about the way that we look at these cases, erring on the side of parsimony, and it's not entirely connected, but the recent news of repatriations out of northeastern Syria is, I think, telling, because it's showing a policy, if you could even call it that. It's really been a situation where politicians have kicked the can down the road, so to speak, and haven't wanted to deal with it. And I think, you know, this is a good example of administrative measures. You know, we're talking about in a different context of, hey, if we don't even know what's happening, how can we have a logical or transparent debate? And I think that's a concern that folks have here in the U.S. And I know from talking to colleagues and friends in Europe, there's similar situations there.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Maybe just to follow up on what you said, and I think an aspect that hasn't been addressed yet is, like, as Ben Saul mentioned, administrative measures can be punitive in practice, and they often circumvent the safeguards that are available in criminal proceedings. But what we actually see is that there's also an increase of administrative measures after a criminal conviction, after someone has served their sentence. And we see that in two different forms. So they are post-monitoring release measures being imposed on persons that have been convicted and who have served their sentence. But what we also see, and we do have data on this, is the deprivation of nationality after a criminal conviction. So there are two forms. One is that you deprive someone of his nationality because they pose a risk to national security. And that is often done when they are still abroad, so you can prevent them of returning back to the country. But what we see, and we have actual data on that, as part of our research, which we recently concluded on the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of female returnees in Belgium, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. We see that in three countries, with the exception of Germany, that deprivation of nationality after a criminal conviction is being employed. And this raises a lot of human rights concerns. It is perceived as punitive. It's not temporary. So that's also, in that sense, it doesn't look like a classic administrative measure. Obviously, it violates, in some cases, you deprive someone of their nationality, and that is considered a right of all rights, which provides access to many other rights, like the right to work, or access to justice, right to health. But the question is also, how effective is this measure? So from the research that we have done, we've seen that in several cases, the women who are detained, they are taking part in rehabilitation programs. And once their decision has become final, they may be informed that their nationality is going to be deprived. And this is considered to be, to put it very mildly, demotivating. In many cases, they also have children. That doesn't mean that their nationality will be deprived, but you can imagine that causes a lot of stress. They might be taking part in training and learning skills they may not be able to use in the country of the other nationality. They may not even have ties with the country of the other nationality. And in some cases, there's a risk of human rights abuse if they would be deported to the other country. Or the other country may not want to issue a passport, making it very difficult to actually deport someone. So what happens? In some cases, they disappear and live in illegality. they may also consider re-engaging with an extremist group. That doesn't mean that they are going to actually commit a terrorist offense, but it is a concern which several policymakers have indicated that it's a concern. So this is just an example of a different kind of measures, administrative measure, which is not taken, which is not being imposed instead of a criminal proceeding. No, it is on top of, or and one could question whether this would be also a violation of the ne bis in idem principle. Like, you know, aren't we punishing someone twice? I mean, I know one is an administrative measure and the other is a criminal, but for the individual itself, it doesn't make much difference whether you say, oh no, but this is criminal and this is admin. It is a very severe measure. So I just wanted to add that also to the different forms of administrative measures that we have been discussing and the complexities that we have addressed. I maybe want to move on to Cyprian, and we actually already touched upon it a little bit, that you indeed think there is a higher risk of misuse and abuse and overuse. And although it's difficult to have evidence to support that, you know, I'm keen to hear what can be done against that. And secondly, I also would like to hear from you, do you think, even in these turbulent times, that there is space for a legitimate use of administrative measures?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you, Rafael and Colin as well for your inputs. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think on generally, why do they pose higher risk? Indeed, I sort of mentioned it. There is a mechanical part, which is like if we use them more, de facto, the number of abuse or misuse is likely to increase. But I think the main issue really is also this kind of general confusion that I refer to. And for instance, if we find ourselves in, and again, not looking at the actual terrorist incidents, but looking at the narratives around the terrorist threat, if we are in an environment where the message that we get from national security agencies and so on is, yes, absolutely, far right or far left or environmental activists can pose a terrorist threat, then the local authorities may be more concerned about an environmental protest, and they'd be more willing to maybe prohibit it under using a counterterrorism instrument. Or maybe people ill-intentioned with the idea to abuse some of these measures will also be more likely to use these measures, and they will say, well, look, I mean, they're environmental activists, the intelligence tells us that environmental activists maybe pose a terrorist threat. And so that's really where I see all the lines being blurred as the main cause as to why I think it poses a higher risk of misuse, abuse, and overuse. Now, a lot of the issues we see there, we also see elsewhere in counterterrorism and through other measures. And Rafael, you've worked a lot on the criminal prosecution as well. And sometimes it's not because we get a criminal prosecution that we are protected from all risks of abuse or misuse and or overuse. The specificity of administrative measures, however, is that because they're so easy to adopt, there is so much discretion, there is so few safeguards, less scrutiny, less transparency, less accountability. I think there is a greater risk there to see abuse, misuse, overuse also on a much shorter time frame. Whereas counterterrorism prosecution maybe will take longer to pick up and will take longer to produce its effects. I think with administrative measures, we can see the effects happening immediately. And Rafael referred to the prohibition of, the house arrests, the administrative searches and so on of activists in France before. This can be decided within 24 hours and can have very real effects within 24 hours. And whether or not it was correct, if afterwards a court said, no, it was incorrect, the harm is still done. These individuals might have their door just knocked down. They might have lost their job if people think that they're terrorists and so on. So those measures produce very real consequences, and very often they don't give people the space and the forum to actually prove that they're innocent. which you have in a criminal trial, and you don't necessarily have in the use of terrorism administrative measures. Same when a group is banned, as we saw in France recently, even though it wasn't exactly on the ground of terrorism, counter-terrorism, it was the group, environmental activist group, was called eco-terrorism, and then another provision was used to ban this group. And then afterwards, the court found that, no, actually, they had other steps, they had gone beyond what the law allowed. But still, the harm is done. I mean, what bank is going to give a loan to an organization that was called as terrorist and that was briefly prohibited? What journalists are going to want to work with this organization and so on? So they can do a lot of harm very quickly, very easily, with almost no accountability and nowhere to repair the harm that has been done. And then, as you said, Tanya, there is also the issue that administrative measures are supposed to be preventive. And that's already maybe an issue in itself, because we've moved in counterterrorism from a punitive aspect to we need to wait for the facts and we need to wait for the evidence before we hold people accountable, to a situation where prevention means that people are sort of suspects and are treated as such much earlier on. So prevention is already an issue. But the problem with, in some situations, but the problem with admin measures and their use is that even beyond the prevention, sometimes they can be used in a punitive way. And again, here, whether or not it was the intention, house arrests, administrative searches, the dissolution of organizations, banning online content, banning people from entering the country, those contribute already to some kind of punishment. And we don't know whether it was the intention of the authorities that might have adopted them, but it's very much one of the consequences, and it very much has a chilling effect on other people maybe associated with these groups as well. Now, to the question, can they ever be used? I think here, obviously, my position is not that of an intelligence officer. I don't have all the data to say, yes, we need them. What we do know is that there is very little data suggesting, as you mentioned, Tanya, that they're effective in the first place. And when we have seen parliamentary committees investigating the effectiveness of admin measures, the response they got from intelligence was like, well, they were very effective because when we prohibited somebody from traveling, they didn't travel. When we prohibited somebody from going to an event, they didn't go to this event. So in this way, sure, they're effective, but were they effective in preventing terrorism? Because being effective in preventing people from doing what you tell them not to do, that's a given. Now, were they effective for terrorism? We don't know. So my question is, are they really needed in the first place in a lot of the scenarios in which they're used, even before I respond and say whether or not they're acceptable? But my assumption here is to say, well, I mean, we don't have a lot of information as to how the intelligence agencies are dealing with the threat. So maybe they're needed, but if they're needed, not only do they need to comply with necessity, proportionality, and adequacy, as the ICCT already highlighted, but they really need to be treated as exceptional. And here, the kind of analogy image that comes to my mind is a little bit the case of the less lethal weapons. When they were developed, like the taser, like rubber bullets and so on, we said, well, those will be used instead of firearms in situations of last resort when law enforcement would have otherwise used deadly force. And that was the idea. And now I think all of us know that in practice, that's not really how they're used anymore. And now they're used for all sorts of instances where they would have never used firearms in the past. When we see rubber bullets shot at crowds in France or elsewhere, I think it's hard to imagine that before they existed, people would have shot with live ammunition. So I think the risk there is just that, indeed, of the slippery slope. And so given the limited evidence of effectiveness, all these risks of slippery slope and so on, my main take on this would be, sure, they can stay within the law, but with a lot more oversight, with a lot more safeguard, with a lot more transparency, reporting, and accountability for them to be really in compliance with norms of human rights law and rule of law.
Thank you, Cyprian. And fully agree. I mean, they need to serve a legitimate aim. They need to have a legal basis. They need to be proportionate and necessary. I mean, so it also really looks at, what kind of measure you're choosing for what kind of threat and how imminent that threat is. And I think the more remote it is, the more harder it is to argue that you need to indeed impose an admin measure. But just playing a little bit the advocate's devil here, and also keen to hear the other panelists on this. I mean, you do see a tendency that we are moving into the pre-crime space. I mean, normally you criminalize terrorist attacks or acts leading to that, but it's quite common you want to prevent it, so you're moving more indeed in the preventive mode. But you do see a tendency even further moving into the pre-crime space. So one could, for instance, criminalize travel. Some countries have. Or one could say, I will impose an admin measure of travel. And on both accounts, what would be worse and what would be the more accurate way to go? I mean, one of the principles of criminal law is also that you should use it with restraint and only for serious offenses. And the question is, if you are criminalizing travel or other acts which are in the pre-crime space, how would you deal with that? So you see a tension between, on the one hand, that you could criminalize some of these offenses or explore the use of administrative measures. Maybe Cyprian, you should go as first, and then we go to Raphael.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good question indeed. It's not even devil's advocate. I think it's a reasonable point. And here, as I said earlier, and maybe Raphael can speak to that too, the making it, first of all, one of the risks is to say, okay, we get your message. Using counterterrorism for public order is no good. Therefore, we're going to make administrative measures possible in the public order space. And I think that would be clearly the spillover that we've described and an abuse, even though that would make it legal to use maybe similar measures for public order. So that would be a concern, in my opinion. And the other one is that it's definitely, there might be instances where it's legitimate, or where there might be specific reasons why one will want to use it. But the principle is, as you mentioned, in criminal law, that you need facts and evidence before you can apply, especially a punishment. And so that need to remain the governing principle there. And what we see indeed is moving in this pre-crime space is that little by little, we're kind of weakening that main principle in criminal law. And I think, Raphael, that's something that you've also discussed, and yet it's extremely important. Because otherwise, again, out of the idea of caution, maybe because there is maybe a risk, we don't really know, we risk generalizing mechanisms and an approach to punishment, and an approach to the restriction of human rights and freedom that is maybe leaning too much on the let's restrict first and ask questions after than the other way around. So I think that would be one of my main concerns. And then the question you raise of like, is it more likely to make maybe governments adopt other measures and so on better? As Raphael said, and as we've said, a criminal trial is not necessarily inherently it is inherently more protective, but we could also see abuse and misuse in criminal trials. And as Raphael said, we see a number of courts deferring to the judgment, to the appreciation of intelligence agencies in particular. So that would definitely be an issue. Now, it would still add an extra level of review, of due process, of publicity, and so on, that doesn't exist with administrative measures. And now the last thing is the argument makes me think a little bit too of what we hear sometimes in the field of humanitarian law, of armed conflict, when we say, well, okay, so if there are all these rules on how to detain enemy combatants, and that, you can't torture them, you have all sorts of rules against this, is it going to make people on the field more likely to just shoot to kill instead of trying to capture? And I think in the context of armed conflict, it's a very real issue that people are discussing. I think in the context of administrative measures and counterterrorism, it's a bit of a moot argument, because in many instances, there would just not be enough evidence to conduct prosecution, for instance. So I think here really the threshold of administrative measures, because it just gives so much discretion, is the problem. And even though if we could see other measures being used, or law enforcement measures that also has a significant amount of discretion, I think administrative measures do have a unique set of features that make them specifically riskier.
Thanks, Cyprian. Over to you, Rafael. Maybe you want to respond, and maybe also take along the question, if you see a shift in the nature in the use of admin measures in France, and how effective do you think admin measures are in this context versus the risks they raise?
Yes, that's really interesting, because while you were speaking, I was thinking about, is there a good use of administrative measures? Because before coming here, I was thinking of misuse, and we speak about everything, but I was thinking, have I ever seen, good use? But as a lawyer and as an attorney, I don't have access to good measures. I can only see, what is wrong, and my clients ask me to defend them. So in my view, I would say I have never seen a good use of administrative measures. But one I can add from a theoretical viewpoint is, for me, they are dangerous for human rights and rule of law, because they are applied to people who actually did not break the law, or if they did before, as you said regarding post-sentencing measures, they have already made their time. They make their sentence, but they could get more administrative measures. And these kind of measures are therefore based not on what someone did, but on what he could do in the future. Therefore, for me, these kind of measures are an attack of, actually, at least the French Bill of Rights of 1789, and the idea that everybody must know the law and must comply with it because he knows it. But with administrative measures, people are being searched, heard, under house arrest, because they did something, or because the state thinks they are dangerous, even though they didn't break any law. I could understand the argument which would say that we must protect the country against terror attacks. And that's an argument which can be heard, of course. But actually, under French criminal law, and not under administrative measures, we already have a criminal legal system which can which help the police to arrest someone who plans a terror attack even long before it happens. And therefore, there is enough law, enough criminal law to reach such an aim, such a goal. So now what I see is that, for example, I would say that at least in France, the state and the police has become kind of addicted to such measures, especially after November 2015 and the 2 years of the state of emergency I spoke about before. A lot of prefect, as we said in France, which are the head of the police in every department, every state, let's say. They used so much of these measures that they think it could help for any kind of trouble, any kind of public order issue, any kind of someone who is deemed to be dangerous in the place where they are. So there is some kind of addiction, which is kind of dangerous because, as I said before, you make laws against like enemies, against terrorists, and it's applied to everybody. I will give you a very clear and simple example of France. Just after 9/11 in 2001, in France, it was a socialist government. It decided to pass a new law, a new counter-terrorism law. And at that time, the government said, okay, this law will be only for 2 years and only for terrorism issues, for terrorism threats. And these laws, it was not a big deal, but it gave more power, more discretionary power to the police to search the bags and the cars of the people who are in the public space. And with the time, this law became permanent, and it became applied to all kinds of situations. And in 2018, almost 20 years after this law, it has been used against the yellow vest protesters to crash the movement and to forbid people to demonstrate. So we see how a law made against terrorists is used to crash something which is quite normal in the democracy, which is dissent. And to answer more to your question, Tanya, what are the current trends in the terrorism threat? I would not make like calling, a list of the different kind of threats we are facing in France, but I want to underline the fact that in France, the question is who is designing, who is saying that someone is terrorist, who is saying that some group of people could represent a terrorist threat. And this power to define, to qualify something or somebody or a group of people as a terrorist is a political power, which is nowadays in the hands of the French National Anti-Terrorism State Attorney, which is the state attorney in Paris about terrorism issue. And they do have the power to decide that this is terrorism and this is not terrorism. So it's not up to me as an attorney to say these are the trends in terrorism threat. I'm just watching what the state attorney is doing. And more, he's trying to say that, for example, some leftists could be considered as terrorists. And I will, from a legal viewpoint, I will, of course, fight such a qualification. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's clear that we all see, the risks of abuse and misuse and overuse of admin measures are enormous, are big. But at the same time, I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that many states are not going to stop using administrative measures. So that is the reality we also got to deal with. And I think one of those measures is like designations. And I think I would like to ask Colin, also we see that the number of persons and entities that are being designated, it is, in fact, I mean, also an administrative measure. I mean, do you see that there will be a less use of these mechanisms, in particular in the US?
Yeah, well, I think we see it in the UK a little bit too, with a group like National Action, right? That was prescribed, even though it had killed 0 people. Now, the argument I'll get from my British friends is that, well, what's the point of waiting until terrorist groups have actually killed people before we prescribe them? So you get into this whole chicken and the egg argument. Is a group even a terrorist group if it's not committing acts of political violence? So I think, and it made me think of your pre-crime comment earlier, and I think you're exactly right. Look, we can have these conversations about human rights and transparency, and it's all fine and good, but the key challenge and the real test is going to be on the heels of a major terrorist attack, right? Now, 9/11, I think, was an anomaly just because of the scale and size, but you saw, right after 9/11, people being very willing to trade civil liberties for quote unquote security and safety. And the United States government in many ways abused, the goodwill that Americans, I think, had. And if you look at, we could talk about any number of examples from Guantanamo to things that happened in places like Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. But that's, I think, the key moment is on the heels of one of these major attacks, how does society respond? Is there government overreach trying to kind of go for authorities and policies that in normal times wouldn't fly, right? And I think, what kinds of attacks could bring us to a place like that? if you end up having some kind of a WMD style attack, a chemical weapons attack in a Western capital, right? Just because, and this is something I think too often we overlook. We look for body counts, right? How do we measure the impact of an attack? But really, the essence of terrorism is psychological. It doesn't even have to be this mass casualty attack. It has to be something that causes and inflicts widespread fear, which again is the cause. And in many ways, and this isn't just my opinion, but I'm a big believer in believing what terrorists say when they say what they're going to do, because often they mean it, right? And I read a lot of their propaganda, but in many ways, what they want is an overreaction. And so you could argue we're seeing that right now post October 7th, right? What Hamas did, they knew was going to cause the Israelis to overreact, arguably, and not to seek justice, but rather revenge. And those are two different things. And I think that's something that also kind of puts the ball back in the court of terrorists who now are gaining sympathy, even though they're the ones that engineered the attack. So, there's numerous examples sprinkled throughout modern history, but to me, that's the true test, right? When we have some kind of a big attack like this, when people say, I don't care what you need to do, but make me safe. And that plays right into the hands of the terrorist.
Yeah, I mean, Colin, you raised indeed a couple of, I think, interesting points. And I think it is maybe also important to, at least I believe, we need to ask ourselves, and so do actually the governments, not so much us, but can we have a 100% risk-free society? Or are we willing to we settle for slightly less, because indeed it means you might need to restrict certain human rights. What I don't think is necessary, that you need to achieve security, that you need to give up on some of your other civil liberties. I think you can increase the procedural safeguards and the process of how you would restrict those human rights, and then they would be lawful. So I don't think it has to be one or the other. It's a question of applying them better, because I think indeed, once you get to the point that you overreact, like you see happening after 9/11, but also in Europe. I mean, there was this legislation fever. Every time there was an attack, a new law very quickly got adopted without carefully thinking it through, often not meeting certain criteria, such as the criteria of legality, and leaving a lot of space for discretion. And also criminal laws can be overused, and which creates again a breeding ground for radicalization, because certain communities feel they're being targeted by these laws. So I think that is a very valid point. The overreaction is something to be very aware of. Cyprian, maybe you want to respond to that, and also maybe look into, what can the long-term effects be when we see the use of admin measures?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And I'll try and be short so that we have a bit of time still for Q&A. But I completely agree with everything Colin just said, and indeed the overreaction. I think Thomas Renard from ICCT also wrote about this, and it makes me think of this book from a former British intelligence officer, Tom Parker, who called the book The Terrorist Trap, because he argues, like, when we give up on human rights, that's when the terrorists win. And I think whether you look at it from the idealist perspective, the believer in human rights, or even from a cynical perspective, indeed, overreaction often is a loss for the states that embrace it. So now my concern with administrative measures and the recent trends, from what I could see of the anecdotal examples that I reviewed, is precisely that we see it in not a time of crisis. And we saw it grow after, like in the mid-2010s, after the terrorist attacks in France and so on. But we also see that use growing in the past couple of years where we haven't seen major terrorist attacks. So my concern is that we already see this and this overreaction in a time where the threat is not, where they haven't been attacks very recently. So if tomorrow there is one, I think, yes, absolutely, we'll be willing to go even further. And I think that's why it's now that it's absolutely critical to enshrine in the law the safeguards and mechanisms that we can put in place to make sure that next time there is a terrorist attack, because unfortunately there is a big chance it will happen again, we don't overreact and we don't have the tools to overreact. I think that's my concern. But really what we've seen is we don't know if the terrorist incidents, terrorist deaths have really increased, but we know that the sense of threat is still very high. And that I'm concerned about because, again, it allows for some of these developments. And then in terms of the long-term effects, one of the effects that I highlight in the policy brief is indeed the impact on democracy. And often from the perspective of international lawyers, we focus on human rights and rule of law because those are more tangible. Democracy is a bit more of a blurry concept. I mean, after all, is it just voting elections? But arguably there is more to it. And the problem with those measures being used the way they are now against potentially political actors, but again, to be fair to governments there might be actors who are indeed terrorist actors. But the problem is that if we use these measures against actors who may share an ideology, but not necessarily the commitment to terrorism, then I worry that it will impact negatively the civic space and the democratic space. And Colin referred to it already, but I think the risk of backlash there is extremely significant. And we already see it, not in the terrorism space, but in the law enforcement space and crowd control space in France, where the more restrictions there are on the right to protest and so on, the more angry people get and potentially likely to resort to violence eventually. So I think if we live in a world where tomorrow we adopt a lot of these measures against extreme right, extreme left, whatever that means, eventually it's the people who share these ideologies. We can be a significant number of people, including far right, for instance, who will feel that they're targeted and that they're victimized. And victimization is an extremely powerful weapon, as Colin already mentioned. So that's one of my concerns in terms of the long-term impact.
Thank you, Cyprien. I see we have a question. So since 2023, climate activists in the UK face the risk of being referred to anti-terrorism schemes. To be specific, the UK government's Prevent scheme. And one of the effects this decision could have is to deter people from protesting. And could you argue that this seems to be a political move to penalize non-violent political beliefs, rather a genuine concern relating to extremism? Who wants to take a stab at this one?
I'll say just briefly, I think, it's not a binary call. And what I mean by that is, are we talking about people that want to come into an art museum and throw soup on a painting, which I think is highly counterproductive and doesn't win these folks any sympathy and muddles their message. However, it's not terrorism, right? And to lump these people in with others that may seek to emplace objects on a train track to derail a train, which has happened in the United States a couple of times with plots that are shared among environmental activists attempting to stop some oil pipelines. Those are two different categories to me. And so I think it depends on the offense. And look, in the United States, we spend a lot of money on counterterrorism, which means that we have the analysts that are capable of differentiating between nonviolent protest and people that are actively plotting acts of political violence. And so, we've seen before when we lump everybody in the same category, it doesn't work well, right? And in fact, you sometimes end up pushing people that are nonviolent toward violence, right? Because they think no matter what I do, this kind of space is being closed down for me. So to get the attention of folks and to make sure that they know that this is a policy issue, I'm now forced to act, right? And so there's this very kind of true believer element to that. I also think, Cyprien, your point on democracy is well taken. I think it's something that, at least in the US, we've struggled with because particularly during the global war on terrorism, going into Iraq, going into Afghanistan, it warms everybody's heart when they get to see a picture of somebody holding up a purple thumb, right, and saying, look, I voted. But what about the protection of minority rights? Voting is one piece of what happens in a democracy. And I think when we start demonizing minority groups, particularly those we associate with a certain ideology, it's actually further corroding democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And Raphael, maybe you want to go.
Yes, I would like to comment on this, Colin, because I may see a tendency of saying that all kinds of political violence should be qualified as terrorism, because you made this distinction between violence versus non-violence political protest. And I think this is dangerous. This is dangerous to qualify.
Sorry, that's not the point I was making at all.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I didn't get it. I'm sorry because you spoke about you know, the fact of putting paintings, putting you know, climate activists who put paintings. It's not terrorism, of course, but to derail a train, you didn't say that it could be terrorist, but you let us think it could be. You know what I mean?
So essentially
Like,
the difference between like an ordinary crime and a terrorist crime,
yeah.
that's what you're questioning, I found. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because, for example, regarding political violence, all political violence is not terrorist, and it shouldn't be, okay? Because we must make it clear, because otherwise everything could become terrorist. And it's not because terrorist violence, political violence is not terrorist, that it's not criminalized. Of course, in France,
but derailing a train,
political violence is criminalized, and people who are
ideology.
becoming violent are arrested, not for terrorism, but because they are violent, you know, and they can go to jail and everything.
Right. I guess my point is that, you know, the train example, if you seek to derail a train and kill civilians in the name of an ideology, that would be terrorism.
Well, I think actually this exchange is getting to the point of where do you draw the line, and also where do you draw the line, and where is it needed to draw the line. And for instance, Raphael, what you're saying is, in fact, whether or not it's terrorism, there would be plenty of criminal law, ordinary criminal law instruments that allow for the punishment of an instance like this. And then the question is, do we need to call it terrorism or not? And because, as we know, the definition is very moving and leaves a lot of discretion to the authorities or the prosecution authorities and so on.
It varies by country. Look, we don't have a domestic terrorism statute in the United States. So
absolutely. And we know that at the international level, that's one of the main obstacles to having an international definition, because what the Russians mean by terrorism is not the same as what the Americans or the French mean. So I think that's another very important question, is where do we draw the line? And what I was saying earlier too, that I see an issue with activists being targeted, I'm not saying that everything should be allowed, but I'm just saying, indeed, when does it need to come within the realm of this exceptional framework that is terrorism, that can allow for administrative measures for civilians, for all sorts of more invasive measures, as opposed to ordinary criminal law. And I think that's also, indeed, as you say, I felt something that we need to be very cautious, because that can allow for maybe more concerning developments.
Indeed, and I don't think terrorism should be treated as exceptionalism. It is a form of criminal law. So also there, you have to be careful, and we all know that you can also rely on normal, ordinary law, and making that space of exceptionalism bigger also has certain concerns, as under terrorism law, there are different special investigative powers in some countries and different evidentiary thresholds to prove certain crimes. But before we further go down the rabbit hole on what is and what isn't terrorism, we all know there isn't a clear definition on that, but that's the reality we got to deal with. There isn't a definition on violent extremism, neither is there a definition on administrative measure. But I think if we really want to make a meaningful contribution, it is trying to see if there is any space for the use of administrative measures. And if so, especially because we see the reality is it is part of the toolbox of many states, and that it is to see how we can make sure that it would be used in a rule of law and human rights compliant manner, and come up with concrete suggestions on how it can be strengthened. We can also indeed suggest that it shouldn't be used at all. And I think there are plenty of instances probably more than less, that we would consider advising against the use of administrative measures. I want to give Cyprian the final thoughts to you on admin measures. You have exactly 1 minute before we're going to be kicked out. So
thank you so
yours?
much. And thank you, Tanya, and thank you all. Thank you also to the ICCT staff for helping us organizing. No, I think we've covered a lot of the ground, a lot of the most critical issues that arise with administrative measures. I think these questions of where do we draw the line, what is the difference between the counter-terrorism framework and the ordinary crime fighting framework, what are the possible long-term consequences? And Colin, absolutely, I agree with you that democracy in itself, and that's why like the voting part is not the ultimate thing. There's a lot more to democracy, and that's why also human rights are important. But I think those are all the points of tension. And my overall sense, in light of all this, in light of everything we've discussed, is that with all the risks that we see and the really uncertain benefits that we see in a lot of instances where administrative has been used, I think the correct thing to do, especially because we're not in a time under pressure, like Colin, you mentioned, immediately after a terrorist attack, we need to impose extremely high threshold, and we need to reverse the presumption for governments to have to prove a lot more to use administrative measures, more accountability, more transparency before we find ourselves in situations where the population will ask for security measures, and then we'll go downward from there.
Thank you very much, Cyprian. And I would like to thank very much also the other panelists, Raphael and Colin, for taking the time to join us today for this live briefing. And thank you for the audience to attending, and we look forward to seeing you back here again during one of our next live briefings. Thank you and take care.